So, a big welcome to everyone tonight, where we're drawing together some of the insights that we've developed over the weeks on how to do action research projects as a specific project, but also reflecting on the ways in the classroom you're often naturally doing actions, and then you're thinking about the ways in which these actions bring benefits or at other times don't work. So, action research is something that we are often doing informally, but at the same time, it's often valuable to do some formal studies of actions that as teachers we carry out that are designed to improve the ways in which children learn. And there's some great insights into action research that you can apply in your final project from Clark, Horace, Thiel, Yobe, um, in their book on action research from New Prairie Press, Chapter 6, which I encourage you to have a look at. And the details there are on Moodle. In Chapter 6, they begin by discussing the way in which you have gathered data from the project that you set out to do. You've put together a literature review, and now you're asking some essential questions as you put together the final material. That is, how do you organise everything that you've gathered together, the literature and your observations and your data? How do you analyse it? How do you develop it further? How do you present it? How do you get the most out of this final product? You're also thinking about what claims you can make about your data. That is, can you draw big claims, or do you have to be a bit more careful? I think often it's wise to be a bit more careful, not to overstate your claims. You also have to conduct an analysis of your data, and I suggest that you're looking through the data, looking for ideas, and then you use Google Scholar or other ways of gathering information to look more deeply at the ideas that you have. I know for my master's study, I did some education studies of the ways in which students learn, and then had opportunity in a PhD to look at Christian schools and the way in which the number of people attending Christian schools has grown from about 20% of the Australian population to 40% of the Australian population, which raises the question, why do people go to Christian schools? And so I interviewed parents, interviewed some kids, and it was interesting to think about some of the values that drive interest in private school education, and to think about what's driving this increase, and what's the value that's coming out of it. And even now, I find it fascinating as I go in different Christian schools to reflect on what is it that's attracting people to these schools, and how well is it working for different students from different backgrounds. So I've conducted some interviews along those lines and gathered information. And then having gathered that information, it's a real challenge to then analyse it. And really, you just have to look for patterns, just like doing a jigsaw. What are some of the patterns you see there? You put them together and then you explore them, and you get some quite fascinating outcomes. Sometimes you're not that confident about your outcomes. You've got to have a bit of a guess and follow it. So with Christian schools, I think one of the outcomes is spiritual value. That is, people are spiritual, they're seeking meaning. And so if I then go to some scholars who've written about finding purpose and meaning in life, go to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then Google those scholars, I can build something on that, and then I can look at the data and see if students and parents are talking about meaning and value and spiritual value. You then find another discussion on certainty. And so some parents and some children like certainty and scaffolding. And so I then begin to explore that and write that up. So some people call this coding. Some people look for patterns. There are a number of words or terms that you can use to describe what you're looking for, and you can write some notes up. I often keep a notepad and jot down some notes as I work through. You also want to reflect on what are the implications for real life practice in the classroom. And towards the end of your project, you'll write on that. So action research is about collecting some data on your project and then putting it together and thinking about what it means. Um, During the stage of the project, you might also want to think, how did it go according to what I planned? What was the method I wanted to use? How I'm going to organise it, and has it unfolded as I wanted? And you might want to comment on that. You might want to analyse and present your data in different ways. And in a few moments, I'm going to talk about 6 examples of the ways in which 6 different action research projects were put together. And you can read about these 6 action research projects in this Moodle article. Some of your data might be quantitative. You might have numbers, and if you put them into Excel, you could have some amazing graphs that are being drawn. You might be able to look at gender, and you might be able to look at age and all sorts of other data, and you could write that up. But a lot of your data will often be qualitative. That is, you're looking at attitudes, behaviours, feelings, and in order to examine this qualitative data more fully, you'll need to think about what are these different qualities, such as attitudes and behaviours and feelings, really telling us, and often using quotations from your interviews or focus groups or discussions or interviews with teachers or with students can be useful at this point. Quotations are really helpful in that they really show us what's going on. And then you gather and group your data together, and some people will write it on cards these days. You could group paragraphs on your laptop page, and you can cut and paste them, and you could have little colour codes if you want, or number codes, as you sort and shuffle the data into categories. As you develop these categories, you need to think, what's the major points you're making? And so with Christian schools, I think spirituality was one, certainty was another, family connection was another. And so I'll make these categories as areas that I explore, and some of the categories grow and grow, and others diminish as I don't find as much evidence for this. As we've said a number of times, people call this coding. And if you like the idea of coding, you might want to explore this further and dig deeper into it. Or if you feel a bit stressed about that, then treat it less formally, and you don't have to go that far with the coding if you don't want to. In interpreting your findings, you want to narrow these categories or ideas or codes so that you begin to focus on some specific ideas. Ask some big questions and say, my big question is, why are people turning to Christian schools? What are they looking for in Christian schools? And as someone said to me the other day, life doesn't really make sense unless you can answer the big questions. What are we here for? How does everything fit together? And I thought that was a good way to draw together the ideas that I was finding about Christian schools. If you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, then you're not alone, in that I think everyone has a stage in the gathering of the data and putting together a project where you feel a bit overwhelmed. Though a couple of days later, you might feel as though you're making a breakthrough and there's an aha moment, and that's quite joyful as well. So I think we do ebb and flow from times we feel a bit overwhelmed, and it's good to find support at such times from others who are able to encourage you, and to recognise that you'll get through as long as you can put in the time that we've suggested, about 10 hours a week over the period of time that you've been studying. You can put in the number of words. If you can put it together, and if you're really facing stress, you can send me a draft and I can give you some feedback, and that can help the process as well. Creswell, in his writing on research, qualitative data analysis, writes about the ways in which you can have a step-to-step approach that provides a guide for research and action research, in which you talk about the organising of your data, and then you talk about the ways in which you read through the data, looking for the overall meaning and looking for ideas. And then thirdly, you can talk about coding and analysing. And if you were to go to further scholars who've written on coding, you could get some good quotes on that. The code should represent categories or settings that you have, and then themes that are unfolding and ideas that are unfolding, and listening to the ideas that each of you shared over the weeks and over the months that we've covered. Then there's some really great ideas that you've found in your work and that you're engaging with. Ideally, you'll have some good results coming in and you can write them up. If you don't have the good results, you can still write up your literature and your ideas, and you can still put together a very doable project that way. If you find results that are contrary to what you expected, you can also write that up, and that can also be very, very useful. One little section that you might want to include is a discussion of yourself and your background, and we've talked about that a little bit. Who are you? What is your demographic background? Who are your students? Who are the fellow teachers? Where is the school? What do you and other teachers and students believe about teaching and learning? And you may have some in your class who are very positive, some in the school who are positive, and some who are not so positive. And it's worth thinking about some of the reasons for that. What about the topic you're exploring? What do you believe about it? What are your expectations? How does it connect with the experiences that people are having? And you might want to also think about the evidence that you're gathering. How reliable is it? How much does it really show what is going to be useful and applicable? You might want to think about the knowledge and whether you're finding new knowledge and insights that could be explored further, and how trustworthy is the knowledge that you are gathering. You might want to go through the data analysis checklist and think about how the different themes unfold and how reliable they are. But let's take a few moments now to look at the examples that we have from these 6 studies. And the first study that we have, the impact of math vocabulary on understanding, involves a study in which a daily maths worded problem was set. And one of the real concerns was place value, because students often have difficulty with the different places, so units and tens and hundreds and so on. And there's lots of strategies, using coloured rods, coloured squares, lots of other ways to do that. Notice in the outline that we have often a cover page, and then we have a abstract, and then we have the introduction. So let's go now to the example, and I'll put this on the chat if you want to follow the example as well, and you can cut and paste that. Let's go to the example and see how that has worked in this case. So here with this example, so B, there we go. So the impact of maths vocabulary. So notice we've got a cover page first up. And so looking at this cover page, we then got the cover page there. And then as we go down the cover page, we come to the abstract, in which it describes the purpose of the study. Keywords can be included, and then an introduction to why the language maths interventions were chosen and how they were used, and then a little brief introduction to the methodology, how it was carried out, and then a brief introduction to the literature review, which now follows. And so with the literature review, there's an examination of a number of articles on the areas that are being looked at. I think this literature review could be quite a bit larger, and it could have more footnotes or more in-text noting of research. We then have a discussion of the research question, And again, there's more interaction with the scholarly material. And then there is a discussion of the sub-questions as to how using keywords and ideas could improve mathematics. The interventions are then discussed as to how they could use counting of pennies, and then they could have tens place and hundreds place represented. And so that would give an example, and then they could think about ways in which they could have various problems. And some of the problems are listed here. So there's worded problems, and then there's a teacher crafted problem, and then there's further problems that are outlined over a number of days. So that's the goals. Then there's the design of the research, a discussion of the setting. And then because they've got some numerical data coming in, then they can use Excel spreadsheet to show some lovely graphs of the data. The collection of the data is then discussed, and then we have more amazing graphs. Now, don't feel you have to do this, but some students are very good at using Excel or other practices to produce the results, and they can look good. Not necessary, it doesn't have to be done, but some students and those who read it find that useful. The real challenge then is to pull it together, and I would have a discussion session. They've moved fairly quickly into the discussion of the themes and the conclusion. I think that could be longer. They have an interesting section here on recommendations and implications, and then they have a summary and conclusion at the end, and then they've got their references, and then after the references, there could be a appendix. I think they really do need more references that they've got here, 8 to 12 or 15 scholarly references, I think would be good. So let's go through and see if you've got questions, what your thoughts are. This is one example, and there are another 5 examples there, and we can look at some of those. But before we do, let's go through and hear your thoughts on what we have. Let's begin with Amy. So, Amy, how's your project going? What sort of outline will you use to write it up? What are your thoughts on some of the ideas that we've just briefly discussed today? So,
Yeah, that was really helpful. I'm mainly thinking in terms, I've like finished the lessons that my students were doing for the artworks that they have made. And so I marked them against a rubric that I made. And so yeah, I've just been slowly transferring that data over and codifying it against the criteria that I set out in my proposal. So yeah, that's my main focus at the moment, to be able to like collect that and display that well and do it justice. And then
yes.
yeah, I'm already seeing links to the research that I did in my literature review.
And then what were your findings from this idea of teaching history, which has the advantage that it gives more ideas, but the disadvantage is that you are pushing the students into those historical ideas, so there's less freedom. Was it a winner, teaching history? What was your finding?
It was a winner overall, which is good. I would love to do like further similar studies in the future to see how that carries on and across different age levels. I think it'd be really interesting to, like, I'm a high school art teacher, but I think it'd be really interesting to do it with primary students.
Mm.
Yeah, I don't know. I just think that would be really cool. So yeah, that's what I'm up to at the moment. I heard I was like just doing some wider reading over the weekend, nothing related to uni. And I came across a quote that says, oh, what was it? You can only cook with what's in the fridge. And
Wow.
I feel like that really like yeah, encapsulated my project. So it was talking about like books and movies, so nothing to do with art. But yeah, it was really cool to see that idea, like someone else talk about a similar idea in a different part of the arts more broadly. So yeah, and now I have a good little catchphrase to share with people when they ask me what my dissertation is about.
Yes. And you do see that in a lot of art galleries these days. They'll get people in prep year, in year one, two, three, and they'll get them to spot interesting things on some
Yeah.
major historical artworks, and then
Mm.
they will get them to, draw little pictures and things like that. I think I was in one gallery, it might have been in France or something, and you got these 500-year-old artworks, and I stepped a little bit closer to a painting, and the curator came over and said very gruffly to me, be very careful. These are very valuable paintings. And about 5 minutes later, a whole French primary school arrived, and they were running through the thing, pushing each other over. Wow, he doesn't have too much to worry about with me compared to these kids with 500-year-old paintings. But they were having a good time and they were doing different exercises. And that's one of the challenges, boy, being a teacher in things like that, boy. How do
Yeah.
you stop disasters happening?
Yes.
Yes, very interesting. Jordan, how's the project going? What are you finding?
Yeah, project's going well. Sam, I've got all of my so I finished teaching the lesson sequence. I'm one of the challenges that I'm finding is that because I widened the scope of my data collection to the whole of the year cohort, one of the challenges is just chasing up feedback and kind of observations and reflections from teachers who are obviously very busy, especially at this time of the year. So in hindsight, yeah, it would have been nice. I mean, it's given me more data to analyze, which is I guess a good thing. But it also has increased the variables that I have to consider. So yeah, and I'm finding it a bit challenging to chase up teachers and get their insights on what they thought, because that was going to be one of my big points of data collection. So I haven't quite got that, but I have got the kind of the student data to begin analyzing, and I've kind of been analyzing that, and yeah, that's hasn't revealed too much, unfortunately.
Mm,
um,
mm, mm,
in the sense of the data was kind of very similar across the two streams that I was testing. Um,
mm.
so it's similar, but it is different. So there are a few things to talk about there.
And one of the things you can do is if people don't have time to write something down, you can do an audio recording. And these days with your iPhone or whatever, you can audio record just a quick 5 minute chat with a teacher, and that
Mm.
gives you some data. And then you can anonymize it so it's not threatening to anyone. And you can then just get the gist of the ideas. And the great thing about that is you're talking to real live people who have real life differences as to the way they see and interact and understand things. What do you think are the major things that you'll find, Jordan? What'll be the findings that you think will stand out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'd love to know the answer to that. I would like to chat to a few more teachers before I go um and claim any findings. But I think the gist of what I'm finding is that different teachers do different things in different ways, and that is okay. And there might not be a right answer. I
That's
think
so interesting. Yeah,
I
because
think when
you.
I think when I went into it, I
Mm,
was expecting that one would be better than the other. But I've
mm,
chatted with a couple of teachers, and the gist that I get is that they can, even though they might say they might love inductive learning, they sense that the other one is still valuable. And so it's just a matter of getting the balance right at this point, I think, rather than one might be better.
yeah, I think you're right. I think people have a natural tendency towards one or the other, but at the same time, they're aware of the value of the other. And then some students love the inductive more, and others love the deductive more. And so some love discovery learning more, and some love pre-written instruction more. But at the same time, we all love a little bit of this and that, don't we? We mentioned the example of cooking before. And there are
Mm.
times when you want to do some discovery, and other times when you want some pre-given instruction. And the same with music. There are times when you want to just jam yourself and come up with ideas and write your own music. And then there are other times when you want to sit down and learn more carefully and precisely too. And that gives you areas to explore and examine, doesn't it? Which is
Yeah, and it was interesting. This was unrelated to my projects, but just the other day I was chatting with one of my year 11 students. My project is specifically for year 7 and junior science. I was just chatting with one of my year 11 students, and well, they actually came up to me after one of our classes, quite distressed, and they said, "Sir, like, I'm not used to this style of learning where we apply something and then we learn about it. I'm used to learning from a PowerPoint and then practicing and applying." And so that kind of struck me as something to think about. And obviously for that class and for that particular student was something that was bringing them quite a lot of stress.
mm,
So
mm,
yeah, just the fact that different students, these students in year 11, they've gone through school for, however many years, and they've just kind of been exposed to one way, changing that on them can actually be doing them a disservice. Or potentially they've been done a disservice in the past by not being exposed to a wider range of learning techniques.
and that raised the whole question of resilience and flexibility. And some people value that, whereas other people like greater support. And yeah, such interesting questions that are raised by that. Emily, how's your project? How's it unfolding?
Yeah, it's going quite well at the moment. I have made all my graphs, I believe. Yeah, so I sorted out my data and I'm just up to writing the data analysis and the methodology and discussion.
And how's that going for you? Is it a challenge to sort of identify the patterns and to identify the ideas, or do these themes come together okay? And can you then find maybe some Google Scholar discoveries or research that fits in with the patterns you're observing?
I feel like I am seeing some patterns. Like we've seen a lot of improvement in their spelling skills, but I'm waiting for my interviews to come back. But I asked my students some questions at the end of spelling the other day, and like I took photos of their responses, and the other teachers will do the same with their students. Yeah, and so it was really interesting to see how they were enjoying the spelling program, if they saw they were improving in their spelling, if they saw they were improving in their reading and writing. Yeah, and it was interesting to look at their responses and then look at their marks, because we had one kid who was like, I find it boring, it's too easy, but then that's not reflected in their spelling test marks at all.
Mm. That raises very interesting questions, isn't it? Whether sometimes they say things that are a bit different or cover up, other things that
Yeah.
are going on. Yeah, so that's very interesting as well. What do you think your main findings might be?
Um, so far, like what I've discovered and kind of read about the two different spelling programs all kind of agrees with the literature.
Mm,
So the literature is saying, it's probably very boring for some people, that you shouldn't focus on just one methodology when it comes to
mm,
spelling. So you need to look at phonemes, morphology, and like graphemes as well,
mm,
to kind of create a good speller. And I think
mm,
that's what I'm seeing in looking at the spelling programs and kind of the way they're structured. So I have a fair bit of information on those programs.
mm,
Yeah, and then I'm going to go back through their spelling tests and look and see if I can kind of identify where they've used strategies from these programs. I think that would be really interesting.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, and you could examine the whole strategy thing further, couldn't you? And you could, get more ideas from them and develop it further. Sounds so interesting, isn't it? What do you think the secret is to good spelling?
Well, I have a whole section on teachers being trained up in it, like knowing
Mm,
their craft, which
mm,
starts from university. So I think that's a big thing, but yeah, I think it's just exposure to text actually, as
yes,
well as exposure to explicit teaching. So it's a range of
yes,
things.
yes.
Is
And,
unfortunate
and
for some.
yeah, and if you have an interest in the text, then you'll read more text,
Mm.
and it'll stick, won't it? There. So it's yeah, yeah, so fascinating. Isaac, what's working and how's it going?
Yeah, it's going well. I've got everything kind of I need. Like I've put graphs together last week and kind of got most of my data in, and I've just kind of started writing about it. And just what I've noticed, and I found a few just in my kind of research in and around what I'm noticing and trying to figure out what it means and if it was expected or not. Just I found an extra study or two that I hadn't found when I was initially doing my research. That's been really interesting and well interesting. It's been kind of what I was expecting, but it's good to find other things that to connect to what I was expecting.
Mm,
And my biggest thing has been as I've been writing, I realized that usually you kind of present your data and your findings as different to that's a different section to like an analysis of and discussion of what that actually means. But I've found
mm,
myself just in my initial kind of rough, just writing all the thoughts and the research down, I've found myself combining those two quite a
mm,
lot. Because I would take one data set and kind of show it, explain it, and then talk about what it means and move on to the next. And I was actually
mm.
wondering whether that is a way to kind of structure things or if I should find a way to separate those two aspects within my project.
Yeah, you certainly have to experiment with both. One of the things that you try to separate out is the time order of what's happening. And so you even in the introduction, you do try and say almost everything in your introduction, but once you move beyond that, you got to space things out and sort things out a little bit, don't you? So sometimes things that you mention early, you'll then move a bit later, and then some things a bit later you'll bring back, and yeah, sometimes you repeat yourself too. I think is what often occurs. And so you then need to, if something's repeated in 3 paragraphs, you need to gather it all into 1 paragraph. And so I think sometimes you'll even put little headings and subheadings. And with these headings and subheadings, you'll gather all the material under the headings and subheadings in order to stop them just being spread everywhere. Yeah, so I think you want quite distinct groups of ideas often, rather than, and so every paragraph really should have a different idea. So you'll need to pull some ideas out of paragraphs and gather them all together in another paragraph. Yep.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah,
Mm.
just trying to get like separate things. I was actually unsure of how many kind of subheadings to kind of use because I felt I wanted to use more, but I wasn't sure if I should. But that probably be helpful just to break it all up a bit. That's what I'm kind of struggling with as I was writing, not so much the content, but just how to structure it and separate ideas.
Yeah, and you should have one big overall argument that you're looking for, And then you want a small number of major arguments, maybe two, three or four, in which you're saying, hey, these are the three or four major things that I'm finding. And then under the three or four major things, then you have your smaller points as well. So there could be three or four under each of them. And so you tend to have this hierarchy and tier that's breaking up into smaller and smaller bits, but they're all connected together to this one overall argument that you make overall, which you introduce in the introduction and draw together in the conclusion of your project. Sounds good. Jack, how's the project going? What are you finding?
Hello. Yeah, I've put out all my I'm doing, because it's like purposeful teaching. Most of my research gathering has been through sending out forms and allow a Google form that allows for both longer responses and then a bunch of multiple choice answers. And it's funny, I felt like I'd set the form up in a way that allowed people freedom to kind of choose different things. But I think the nature of purpose in teaching is something I feel like isn't, like in my experience, wasn't talked about a lot. Like a lot of times it was, this is what we're learning, not this is why we're learning what we're learning. And it's funny how many people have shared that experience. How I expected a lot more. Oh no, I knew why we learned what we were learning, or I knew why my teacher would use this or that action in my correcting my behavior, or I knew why I was teaching what I was teaching. But yeah, the thing that's been quite, eye-opening is how often people are like, I have no idea what the purpose of learning some of the things that I learned was. And I've got like across multiple forms for both teachers, parents, and students, I've got almost 100% saying, if I knew the purpose, I would have engaged so much more. And it really helps. So I kind of feel like the research that I'm doing, everyone's just agreeing with. So I think in terms of trying to find a breadth of that's, I think my limitation is like, oh, everyone just agrees with my statement. What do I do now? And so I think I'm gonna have to dive deeper into the literature and see what's the main barrier for purpose being expressed. Is there a sense of a generational thing where it was, this is what you just need to learn, just learn it? Is there a sense of not knowing the purpose, but just teaching it at times? Or was it, I don't know. So that's, I think, where I've got to go next. But it's encouraging to see, most people going, look, when I can identify why I'm learning what I'm learning, and see the power in that seems to be quite telling. So, it's interesting, but at the same time, it's like, okay, everyone agrees. Awesome. What do I do now?
And that relates to what Maslow and others have written about in the psychology of motivations. That is, people have these big drives about meaning and interest, and it shifts a bit too. And it's often a challenge to identify what they are. I mean, you've got social interests, you've got intellectual interests, you've got mystery interests, and there's lots of different things that are driving people. So fascinating. And I like your idea of diving into the literature further, in that I think you really can discover things. But if you then mix that with some case study examples where you've interviewed a person, talked to a person, the complexity of the realities as well. And it's a great mix, isn't it, of having case studies as well as having depth of theory as well. Yeah, sounds great. XP. Go
I
on.
was going to say one question that I had in terms of, so my research I will be able to have a lot of diagrams and things.
Mm,
A picture is worth 1,000 words. So if I have 8 of those, no.
mm,
In
good.
terms of having pictures and our word count, is there any
Mm.
kind of correlation there, or?
Now, pictures are fine. One of the difficulties with pictures is the memory space. So one of the things that I would often do is to save the picture into a photograph program, like sort of a little Microsoft thing, and then save
Mm,
it. And so you might have a picture that's sort of 1.5 gigabytes, and you might
mm,
save it as a few, 20 or 30 kilobytes of data. So I think that's quite important. And then the other
mm,
thing is that sometimes it's useful to have the document as a Word document and then to have a separate document for the pictures. And that way, again, if you're worried about memory space, if it's being emailed or whatever, or the format, it means that you got a fairly simple Word document, whereas the pictures document can be hungrier and take up more space. So, got to watch some of those things a little bit as well. And then I guess people may raise ethical questions, though I think if you're saying that in some ways the only people who are seeing these pictures are yourself or whatever, so it's not a widely circulated document. But if it was going to be, say, published, then anyone there you may give warnings, and that's interesting. Sometimes people will get individuals to sign, but other times people will just put a great sign over the door saying anyone who comes onto this property realizes that they may be photographed. And so, the ethical questions can vary a bit as well. So, yeah, sounds good.
wonderful.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks, Jack. That sounds really good, really interesting. Yeah. SP, how's the project going?
It's going, Sam. Thank you. Just to go back to that last question, I think the
Mm.
idea with the 8 images is that a picture's 1,000 words. So 8 images, 8,000 words, project's done.
He did write it down. He wrote it down. We can do it.
Yes,
Yes,
it's official.
that's beautiful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I've actually been out sick all last week, so I'm a little behind. I'm just grabbing the last pieces of my data and currently analyzing what I already have. So
Mm.
it's going good. Literally, like everyone has said, it's matching the literature. What I'm doing,
Yes,
matching the literature, and the results are just all matching, which
yes.
in a sense doesn't add a lot of diversity and it's harder to spell out a lot of things in the paper because everyone yep,
Mm.
agree. You know what I mean?
Yes, yes.
Which is a good thing, but it's also like at least me scratching my head a bit about what to write.
Yeah, I guess you can. One thing you can think about is, are there counter arguments to what you're saying? And I guess, yeah. So do you think there would be any counter arguments to what you're finding and saying, SP?
Well, I think it's more that so my piece is on literacy and reading fluency, and I think my national education system, sorry, my local educational system just got a shout out for its great work towards literacy. But the only counter arguments I can think is more relates to we putting so much effort into this. What about another thing?
Mm,
That's probably the only thing that really comes to mind. But I'm not sure whether that's steering too far from the actual project at hand.
mm. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, isn't it? Because certainly since 1500 through to 17, 1800 through to the present, there's been a huge move from being, say, agricultural people who are building and planting, to being people who sit in chairs and read. And so, yeah, the whole cultural shift has been one towards literacy, which I think we'd say expands us. And then probably the more words you know, the more storylines you know, the more expansive your mind and life might be. But then you raise the other question, SP, is that the same as doing? So to read about Antarctica, is that the same as walking across Antarctica? Or to read about Mount Kosciuszko National Park, is that the same as hiking there or the Kokoda Trail? And so,
Yeah, that's a
yeah,
good.
yeah.
I think, yeah, it's interesting because I've seen that literacy affects all subject areas, and I'm looking.
Mm,
I was teaching a science class, so I actually put a reading fluency activity integrated it into my science class, just to see how it would go, understanding concepts I've already learnt, the
mm.
students already learnt, and how they were able to pick up on everything. Like it's important, but obviously it doesn't replace the real thing.
Yes,
I think,
yes.
I
It's-
think, sorry,
mm.
you go.
Yeah, I was thinking as well, being creative, it's one thing to read a story, but to write a story is a bit different. It's one thing to listen to a piece of music, but another to compose or play a piece of music, isn't it? Creativity is
Yeah,
something, yeah,
and
rather than passive.
it's one thing also to read an action research paper, and it's a different thing to write it. Something I've learned.
Well said.
Yeah, so I'm doing a little bit more data collection. My school's just finished their report writing, so I'm going to take this opportunity now to ask teachers about what they've seen in literacy improvement recently,
Yes.
and that's going to probably expand my data. But then I'm just trying to think where in that I can maybe think about drawing in some counter arguments then. Like,
Yeah, I think it's
which
always
way-
worth thinking about, isn't it? Yeah.
is it more like saying, did what worked before work better
Mm, mm,
in that sense? Particularly if you've got teachers who've been teaching nearly 30 years.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And certainly in your second last, third last paragraph, you can have areas for further research. That is, should we be encouraging more creative writing rather than just reading? Should we be encouraging more critical literacy? There were even again, other people argue that critical literacy, where we pull things apart so much, we're not just enjoying it for enjoyment's sake. There's something about listening to material as well, isn't there? Which is can be very valuable. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's so true. Yeah.
Mm.
Still got a fair bit to do, obviously.
Yes, yes,
A lot of
yes.
iterations. Thanks, Sam.
Yeah. No, that's great. I really like the way each one's project is going. And Nancy was telling me before about how hers is going, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Before we do, let's have a look at another example. This one is the effects of game-based learning and attitude and achievement in elementary mathematics. And the idea is that there are various games that you could play. And so a game like Battleships has you looking at coordinates of where things are. And then the conclusion to the game's project could be a whole range of puzzles and games that involve coordinates. And so I think this whole approach to games playing to develop mathematics, including Zombies, Connect Four, Twister, City Planner. So there's a whole heap of different games that use coordinates and helps to encourage mathematics. And one of the ideas here is that mathematics, rather than being boring, or mathematics, rather than being associated with fear and phobia, can be something that can be explored, enjoyed, and there can be real value in mathematics. And so I think a lot of great ideas there. And so let's have a look now at this as another example of an action research project. And this is game playing in mathematics. So he's got his cover page, which is the title, his name, and then he's got the abstract there at the beginning. Games playing can help make maths come alive. There's a scholar that he's engaging with. And then he begins in the introduction. Many students begin to develop negative attitudes towards maths, and he's got a scholar, Leroy and Bressoy, say this. Many struggle with maths, and then Leroy and Bressoy note that struggling with maths often can produce a toxic atmosphere, fostering low motivation, and dislike of mathematics can continue to develop further. Anxiety is then discussed, which I think is quite an important discussion when it comes to mathematics. However, many students are very interested in games and games playing. And so the methodology is to conduct a series of activities involving games, and then to look at the way students from different backgrounds engage with these. And then each day of the program, they introduce the different games. The data is then collected, and then it's examined and analysed. And then the students are interviewed, photographs are taken, field notes are collected, student assessment is used, and then various artifacts, examples of the work, which could include photos and video recordings, are collected. Then we have the results, where we have attitude being measured. And so we see that attitudes towards maths increases. It makes you wonder what other things you could do to increase mathematics. In primary school, of course, they will have a pizza that they'll cut up, and they'll do fractions with a pizza, which would make interest in fractions really grow over time. And then you take photographs, and then you look at the content, and then we've got some use of graphs here, we've got use of numbers, and then you've got the conclusion there at the end, where they draw together the results, and then you've got the references being listed here, and then you could have an appendix after the references. So I thought that was quite an interesting example that we have of games playing there. And that's on Moodle if you want to pick up on that for week 12. And then we have another one where they listen to music as part of, or listen to stories rather, as part of literacy development, and with the Audible ads. Obviously, this is a growing area of interest. And then, say, at the time of the iPod, people would listen to stories, and then they would learn through that. So we got a review of the literature on the benefits of listening to stories and use of storytelling machines. Then they got a number of questions that are being asked, the methodology as to how it's going to be carried out. These are the different stories that they have, and then discussion of the age group, use of songs as well to bring the stories alive. And then the findings, they discuss about the use of gadgets to listen on. Why do people prefer different stories? What about earphones? So they're picking up on themes here, and then they're highlighting the themes, length of time, length of story, convenient time, location, parent-student interactions. So these are all themes that start to come from the data being analysed and codified. They got a graph here, and also they got a table where they lay out the benefits of using this approach. It improves vocabulary, encourages reading, encourages imagination, encourages listening. But some of the problems are some of the students struggle with listening. They have a short attention span. Some couldn't operate the gadget. One student took home an empty iPod, and the teacher had to reload the stories. Sometimes it's difficult to determine which stories the students had already heard. So certainly a table like that can be useful, and then the conclusions draws together the findings, and then you have the references at the end. Notice quite a long conclusion here that includes also implications for the future research and for teachers and parents from this project. So that one's works really well, and I found that quite fascinating, listening to stories. Another one here on reading and the idea of close reading and the benefits that can come from close reading. And we can see a nice project unfolding here. And so close reading in the urban classroom. The purpose of this project is to discuss my experience of reading in an urban classroom using autoethnographic methods. So it explains ideas that I encountered when teaching close reading. We then have the introduction. After we read this passage, we will apply the reading strategy and we'll think about application and what it means. And then the methodology, the autoethnographic method, and you could also have writing and creative writing would be another approach. So close reading begins with a discussion of the meaning of the word close reading, with the tide of changes, with the development of the Common Core. This is fits with that. Urban settings can also fit with this. Close reading strategies are then discussed. And notice there's quite an interaction with the scholarly literature that's being engaged as we go through. There's quite a discussion of coding in this example. And then there's the idea of signposts, where we're looking for ideas and concepts, particularly as students are reading texts, and they too are looking for contrasts and contradictions, ideas of authenticity. They're looking for the ways that language is used in different ways. Annotations are another close reading strategy. Then there's the 4A's protocol that is discussed using double entry journeys. To notice this sort of project is going much further and much deeper, which you often can with older students. And then there's a number of questions that are being discussed. So this is quite a different approach, I think, in this example that we see there, which differs a little bit from the simpler approaches we see in the others. There's another one here using flexible small groups in mathematics. And you can work with all sorts of different groups, can't you? And you can examine them and look at them and get different results. So the effect of small groups in maths achievement. And so we've got here the abstract at the beginning, which talks about small groups and maths achievement. We've got the introduction, which introduces the ideas. Then background is a major emphasis here. The literature review, I think, is the real strength of where things are going to go. Notice sometimes that even for one sentence, they got 5 or 6 references. So that really varies. Often students might have one reference in a paragraph. The methodology has a discussion of the settings, their background, the participants, the interventions that are being used, and how these interventions might work. Data collection is gathered in various ways. Work samples are gathered, and you could have photographs of them to show how students go. That really lifts interest, I think. Interpretation of the data then becomes quite important, and then the conclusion draws together the findings. And then the final one is on biliteracy in an English-only classroom. And so this is another interesting example of an action research project. And we see in this project, again, we begin with the abstract. The teacher inquiry seeks to explore a non-Spanish teaching teacher, introduces bilingual pedagogies, and it fosters biliteracy amongst the students, and then it draws together the findings. And so begins with a discussion of how the ideas came about, a discussion of what the school is like, and then a discussion of personal experience. You can introduce a bit of the personal at times, but you've got to be careful not to overdo it and carry it too far, unless you're really skillful at that. You then document what unfolds in the project, and then you look at some of the benefits that flow out of the project, both from the data recorded and also from the literacy. You look at the benefits for preserving and sharing family stories and knowledge. You then have some examples included here, and more examples that are included, and then some quotations, which makes it interesting. And this is really lifted then if you interact with the examples and have a discussion of material as well. Conclusion draws it all together, and then you have the references. So Nancy, how's your project going? What are you finding from these insights that we're discussing today? Over to Nancy.
Yes, I think I'm more confused now. I have prepared a lot of research in my,
Yes.
I think I have to cut down on a lot of research because
Mm,
as I can see that it's more like coding and analyzing. It's less
yes.
research in the second part. Yeah.
I
So
think
I
that's
have,
often the challenge is we do often have way more ideas and data than we can use. Now, one solution is that you can put some of it in the appendix and then just draw out the small sample that you think is the most interesting thing. So what do you think is the most interesting thing you're finding, Nancy?
I'm speaking about teaching strategies, and I'm talking
Mm,
about learning difficulties. So I've mentioned
mm,
all the learning difficulties that I have in every single classroom, which are 4 different
yes,
classrooms. And I've
yes,
spoken about each single one. I've got some scholars
yes,
talking about each single one, and then about teaching strategies with
yeah,
scholars too. And then I
yes,
analyzed the data and I spoke about how like the numbers in statistics, like the percentage in each classroom and the
yes,
percentage in a school, how much is it compared to the whole school. And then I
yes,
spoke about I did the coding, and I did coding the three-way coding where I
yes,
had where I had to mention the themes, main themes, and the sub themes and the points, and I made that
mm,
into a graph too. And
mm,
then I summarized all this, and I said that the most the teaching strategies that are mostly used by teachers at ACC are the top 2, whereas they vary with the other 2 because of generation. Like the other ones have
mm.
experience and they're all like older in age and they don't use ICT, whereas the younger ones are more into using ICT. So that's how I did mine. Yeah.
Yeah. So certainly, I think that's great material. Now,
Mm.
one of the things that you can do is you can rank the learning difficulties. So,
I've done
what do you,
that. I've done ranking the learning difficulties and I've done ranking the teaching strategies. So I've asked the
yeah,
teachers to rank them from 1 to 10, which one they use the most and which one the
yeah,
least.
yes.
Mm.
And I think your project should focus most on the number 1, and then slightly less on the number 2 and the number 3. And then once you get past, say, number 5, you may not, you could put some of that in an appendix or whatever. So what do you think is the number 1 difficulty and the number 1 strategy?
EDI and hands-on activities is the number 1 with all 4 teachers. So I
Yes.
just focus on these 2 and I
Mm,
just reduce the word count and the other strategies?
Yeah, yeah. I
Okay.
think that's the solution, is that it makes it interesting, and then the others you just reduce the word count and you keep that for another day. Yeah, and that way it makes it a more doable project, doesn't it?
Yeah. And with the
Yeah.
with the learning difficulties, I just focus on like the highest percentage, which is the behavior difficulty and the learning difficulty
Mm,
and the English as a second language, and these are the highest. And I
yes.
ignore the other
Yes.
ones. I just don't write anything about them, or I just write it very briefly.
Briefly, I think you should always write it,
Mm.
but it would just be a few sentences. Whereas the number one, number two, number three, etc., that's where you write whole paragraphs about those, and then you write a bit less about the others. Some people, of course, will sometimes, cover, 5 or 10, but you got to be a bit careful if you cover too many.
Mm.
Sometimes you can make it work, but I think you probably find usually that focusing most on the number ones, number twos, number threes works well. Yeah, sounds good.
Shall I cut on this? Shall I cut on like more data? Shall I cut on that, or just less research, or just leave it and reduce the number count as much as I can?
Yeah, yeah, and you can put a little bit in, say, footnotes and appendixes, that sort of thing. Shuffle it a little. Yeah, I think it's what you want is sort of one overall argument saying that learning difficulties are arising for various reasons, and then the strategies such as hands-on activities are very helpful. So yeah, yeah, and then I guess you got to just give it a go, don't you? And uh, see it come together. It sounds so interesting and valuable. Yeah, yeah, I think it's very good. Yeah, well done. Amy, any thoughts as we draw things together? Thoughts or questions? And then Jordan, do you have thoughts or questions?
No, not particularly, Sam. That's pretty
Mm.
helpful. I think I just need to chase up the remaining data that I need and then put together my discussion and findings.
Yeah, sounds good. Emily, and then Isaac, any thoughts or questions as we draw things together?
No, I feel like this lecture's really helped me kind of work out how I want to structure my action research project. So yeah.
So good. Isaac?
Yeah, no, all good. It's just good seeing some different examples as well of how things are structured. Because yeah, structure was the biggest thing I still needed to figure out. So that's helpful.
Yeah, sounds good. Jack, and then SP. Jack, any questions? Any
Yeah,
thoughts?
just gonna work on those 8 pictures, and then I feel pretty good, and it was nice to kind of hear how everyone else is going, and then kind of contrast that with where I'm at, and then go from there. So thank you.
Yeah, that's great. And then SP, how's it all coming together?
Yeah, similar to what everyone else has said, really. Just it's good just to get clarity on the overall structure of everything and just how that's going to fit in. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So let's just, as we're drawing things together, let's remind each other of the resources that we have. A lot of the resources are in the second part of the Moodle there to read, but going back to the beginning of the resources on the Moodle, you'll be able to see some of the areas that we have covered. And so apologies if we're jumping through. Let's have a look then. If I spread out, we have a welcome to what we're doing. And this reminds us of the importance of action research, and you might want to include in your final project a paragraph on what action research is about. We also encourage keeping a portfolio. So if there's resources that you collect along the way, an observation journal, and also a reflection journal where you reflect on what we are covering. So you could have some reflections and observations that you include each time. Then if we go down further, we come to some other resources that we have available. And then we come to week 1, which has the material there. Or if you have any difficulty with the assessments, then let me know. We are under a bit of pressure time-wise because the semester is very much racing upon us. Often the outline there in assessment 1, we gave you an outline with the title, context, literature review, methodology, ethics, and sample references. You can use all of this material. You can cut and paste bits of it, change it as much as you want, and include it in your final project. And then it's similar to about a third or so of your final project. And then in your final project, you have an outline similar to the examples that we have seen today and shown you today. And then there's a discussion of referencing and other policies there that you can remind yourself of as we go through. There's a lot of library resources, perhaps 12's resource on action research by Jim Twelves. You might want to read that. And then there's some other resources as well. So there's some videos there too. If you want some other material on action research, there's discussion of methodology. A lot of this relates to what we were doing earlier on in the project, but you could certainly use some of those ideas and resources if you're struggling with ideas as well. And then after that, we come to each of the weekly topics. And so in the literature review, there's a discussion there. So you take some time there. Introduction to what action research is about. You could read through what we're setting out to do when we do an action research. And then I've put up here some readings and videos that you might want to go and look back at if you want to write a paragraph on what action research is and you want to insert that in your project. As well as that, we have some other discussion there, particularly relating to the outline. So you might want to think about the wording of your title, how to write your abstract, your literature review, your ethics, and then you've got your analysis and you've got your conclusion to think about as well. When it comes to the reflection journal, the very end of this project, we have a discussion of reflection journal. You could think about what we're doing there. Week 2, we had further discussion of action research, and we have some extra resources there. Chapter 2 discusses what action research involves. You can get some nice quotes from that to include in your project. Week 3, you've got to decide what you're focusing on. You could get some ideas from here that you could include in your discussion. Week 4, design the actual outline of what you're doing, what methodology you'll use. So you could think about that. Week 5, carrying it out. How did it go? How effective was it? And then there's some readings there that you could draw on if you're going to discuss that part in your final project. Week 6, you conduct the project, you monitor what happens, how well did it go, what could be improved. And then we come to the second half, which we've been focusing on more recently, which is carrying out the project, analysing the data, and then codifying it and then writing it up. And so this is where you'll find some more recent resources that you could use and apply. And then we've got some added material here on coding, which you don't have to use, but you may find that valuable to use as well. And then there's some more resources to help you. So there's plenty of resources there if you need them, though in many ways it's about doing the project itself. And then you'll find that we have this list of resources, which are the examples that I've gone through today. This goes quite nicely an outline that you can use that can be quite helpful and effective for you. So do we have any questions as we draw to a close? So if there's no more questions, we might conclude there. I've really enjoyed working with you on the project and hearing about the very interesting teaching roles that you're involved with. And so I encourage you that these sort of projects remind us of the value of knowing your topic area, knowing about the task of teaching, knowing about some of these other areas as well, ethics and authenticity. I think as Christians, we have the added value of extra values that secular people don't have so much, such as love and grace and caring and kindness. And I think that really brings more into our teaching than those who just treat it as a job that they switch off from. And from hearing each one of you talk and share, I see there's a lot of passion that you have both for your subjects and also for your students and also for pastoral care too. So I think they're a great combination of things to offer. So thank you each one for sharing, and it's a real joy to work with you, and I look forward to reading your projects. So thank you.
Thank
So I
you.
look forward. Yeah,
Thank
thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Sam, for
Nancy.
everything.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks, Emily. Thank you, each one. Thanks, SP. Thanks, Nancy.